Danny in Vancouver that she reached out to about talking to them.
Yeah, on
She
Twitter.
sends congratulations. They want to do a road event.
It is crazy.
It is crazy. It is crazy.
Right? It's crazy.
It's not crazy. I need water. Do you need water? Looks like
Yeah, I could use some. Can I actually?
yeah.
I'll really have to pee.
Should
Should be hydrated. Yeah, it's okay. I don't have to pee now, but if I drink all the water.
It's like more chocolate.
No, it's not. Because there's like, we did all this, right? But one of the main things we did is we expanded. Like, you have to launch right control campaigns in all of these cities that finally can do that for the first time in a generation. And in addition to that, there's just like so much that we want to do about. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. What did we win? And why did we win it? And just like a lot of like underrated debrief. So we're trying to work out all those questions. And so yeah, it's like one of the things that we always said is that
Yeah, I mean, I guess the pressures of doing Upstate, Downstate, and staying attentive to the New York City stuff is insane, but...
yeah, and I think with it, it's like really a question.
All right.
Like, where do we go from here?
Okay, folks, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to see so many people here. Glad you could join us. My name is Karen Narefsky. I'm a contributing editor for Jacobin, and I'm one of the co-editors of the most recent issue, Home Improvement, along with Cyrus Lewis. And so tonight we have a really good program. We have copies of the issue for sale over here. Some of you have already gotten them, but they'll be available along with some other books, so definitely check those out. And just to remind people, we also are streaming the event. So just keep that in mind. I think we'll have a brief panel discussion, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and audience participation, and we'll end the live stream. We'll end the live stream before the Q&A discussion, and we'll let people who are watching from home go do whatever they need to do. I actually was just saying to Sam, it's like, I'm a little embarrassed to say how long I've been working on putting this issue together. I will say that our current real estate developer president had just been elected, and campaigns for rent control were kicking off in New York, California, Illinois, and other states, and future Green New Deal advocate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was still working as a bartender in Manhattan. But if anything, I think it's good that we spent the time because housing has become only a more pressing issue in the last few years. And it's like a little weird to say that because of course housing is a pressing issue. It seems very obvious. But what I mean is a couple things. One, that the tenant movement really has built some serious power and had some important wins over the last few years. That the depravity of the real estate industry has become clearer to many people and has become much more stark as part of our political discourse, and also that the actual crisis of homelessness and housing unaffordability has unfortunately continued to get much worse. So even though we live in a country whose national mythology of success is all about homeownership, about a third of people in the US rent, and that figure continues to grow. And unless you're really wealthy, being a homeowner is not necessarily a walk in the park either. So we have people who are really struggling with this sort of basic component of their livelihood. And so we've seen that like housing, along with many other public goods, has followed a trajectory of increasing privatization and commodification in this country over the last half century. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the idea of housing for all has never been embraced in this country, but there was a brief burst of enthusiasm in public housing construction sort of between World War I and lasting until the 1960s and early 70s. So in the early 70s, the Nixon administration declared a moratorium on construction of federally funded housing. When the moratorium was lifted, it didn't mean that we went back to building public housing projects, but instead that was when the Section 8 program began, basically giving a direct subsidy to private landlords of poor tenants. And since then, the federal government has just doubled down on the shift to private housing during the Clinton administration under Hope 6 and as part of the welfare reform legislation, which actually banned new construction of public housing units beyond what existed in the late 90s. Since then, billions of dollars of tax credits have been distributed to banks and investors through the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, and billions of dollars have been cut from public housing budgets. And the results are a total disaster. There are 500,000 homeless people in the US, and millions more live on the edge of displacement. And it's interesting that although this is clearly a national problem with a national scope, until now, national politicians have kind of succeeded in avoiding the issue. And local politicians have really been the target, so people get mad at their city councilor or their mayor or their state legislature. But until now, it hasn't really been an issue that senators and presidential candidates have had to deal with. But increasingly, this is shifting, which is a good thing because especially on the local level, local politicians rely on property taxes to provide public services, and they rely on developer donations to stay in office, so they haven't been willing to square off against private developers and landlords. But right now, what we need is really a coherent vision to address the housing crisis at the state level and the national level. And the current political moment really creates an opportunity for us to do that, to recognize housing as a basic right instead of a marketable commodity or a complex policy problem. And actually, some of the campaigns for rent control that were kicking off in 2017 have seen some victories this year. So yeah, it's an exciting moment. I think we'll talk more about it, but my hope is that the left continues to build on this momentum to make high quality, well-funded, environmentally sustainable, and widely available social housing part of our agenda in the coming years. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists for tonight, who are all contributors to Jacobin's most recent issue, Home Improvement. So Sam Stein is a PhD candidate in geography at CUNY, and the author of Capital City, Gentrification, and the Real Estate State, which was recently released from Jacobin and Verso Books. Sia Weaver is an organizer and researcher in New York and the coordinator of the recently victorious Housing Justice for All campaign in New York. And Daniel Aldana Cohen is assistant professor of sociology at University of Pennsylvania and the director of the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative. So really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. So I think I'm just going to kick it off with a series of questions for everybody. And I'm not necessarily going to go in order of where people are sitting, but Sia, I did want to ask you to talk a little bit about the universal rent control campaign, brought together tenants from across the state, and also relied on a combination of electoral and non-electoral organizing strategies. So if you could just talk a little bit about the strategy of building tenant power in New York State to have that victory.
Totally. So can folks hear me? I'm like bad at talking into microphones. So I want to start by thanking many of you in this audience who threw down in our fight to strengthen and expand tenants' rights in New York State. It has been a really moving experience to have the ability to organize with so many of you and so many renters from really, truly, from Long Island to Buffalo to fight for dignity in their housing. And I'm very thankful for the work that everybody has put in to make this victory possible. So thank you. we founded the Upstate Downstate Housing Alliance in 2017, or maybe it was late 2016, really coming off of the sort of catastrophic political event that Karen mentioned when we elected a landlord to the White House for some reason. And our thinking was that for many, many years, tenants in New York had really been on the defensive, and we were fighting to protect this sort of weird and wonky system of rent stabilization that we'd had since a century, that was sort of working to keep 2.5 million people in their home, but it was broken, and we thought that if we just keep trying to protect what we have, we're not even going to be successful at doing that. We really wanted to go on the offensive, and so we made a sort of strategic choice that, in order to win what we have now, or in order to fix what we have now, we want to be able to offensively target the real estate industry and the politicians that enable it and organize tenants across the state and demand more. So it really did start with this sort of like strategic goal of, I don't want to say we wanted to sell out the upstate New York tenants, because we didn't. That's not what we wanted to do. But we did want to demand something much, much larger than what we had. And throughout that process, we met renters across, there's no reason why a tenant in New York City should face different renting conditions than a tenant in Buffalo. Every renter should have the right to renew their lease and the right to stay in their home. And so we built a statewide coalition of tenants who wanted to fight for housing as a human right, who wanted to fight against the sort of chokehold that the real estate industry has on New York politics. And that's true across the state. It's not just true in New York City. So it was really about tenants going on the offensive, and it was really, Karen mentioned the electoral strategies. I think one of the things that was notable about this campaign is that it was also a combination of sort of renters rising up against that political power that landlords hold in Albany. So quickly in our organizing, one of the demands that took hold immediately was this demand to stop working with elected officials who take money from landlords. It was great. And that was something that was sort of bizarre and a sort of not... Real estate money in politics is accepted as normal in New York, and it was accepted as normal in New York really up until maybe it started in 2015, but now the demand don't give money or don't work with politicians that take money from landlords is quickly becoming a sort of mainstream demand. And so I think that we did have some electoral victories. We elected Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We took back the New York State Senate. We elected a socialist to the New York State Senate. But I don't think it's the sort of impact of having progressives in office that helped win us rent control. I think it was a sort of way that electoralism indicates mass politics, and electoralism also is a good way for a lot of people to vilify landlords. And it's a big way to create fear among people who hold power. And that was really what propelled us to victory. And that's how we were able to translate the electoral work into a real big policy win.
Thanks. So, Sia, you were talking a little bit about the chokehold that the real estate industry has. And Sam, I know that's something that you had talked about in your book. So what do you think that the changes in New York and around the country reveal about the power of the real estate industry? And is anything... what has changed about their position? Is anything changing now?
Sure. Real estate remains tremendously powerful in their hold on politicians, in their hegemonic position regarding urban planning and development. But I think these recent victories show that they're also vulnerable, that you can't just keep screwing over millions of people and expect nothing to happen. We're also seeing in the way that the real estate industry is at least symbolically or ceremonially panicking. I don't know how real the panic is, but propelling the image of panic, that they have invested a whole lot of money in the proposal that land and property values will rise eternally, and with them rents, and there's nothing that can stop it. And some of that was working out for a very long time. But rent control is important in that it throws a wrench into some of those propositions. So there's a lot of people who took out tremendous amounts of debt to buy rent-stabilized or rent-controlled properties with the assumption that they could just get around the laws. They could raise the rents anyway, they could evict the tenants, and they could close a rent gap. And now it's going to be significantly harder to do that. Most of the loopholes, which were very intentionally added to the laws over the years, were taken away. Some of them were weakened. And so now they are in a lot of shit, and they deserve to be, because they bought properties on the premise that they could evict all the tenants. And now they're freaking out and saying this is some sort of a public crisis. It's not. It's a private crisis for actually a very small number of people who have an enormous amount of power. So that's nice. And I think it demonstrates, dramatizes the weakness of the real estate, the concentration of real estate capital in many cities. So there's a whole lot of the country that is not experiencing this problem at all. That's important to acknowledge. But in the places that are, there's tons and tons and tons of capital, highly debt-ridden, that's invested in this land that actually puts tenants in a very significant structural position in the economy. It's them paying more and more and more rent that guarantees the returns for all those investors. Now, real estate is the majority of the world's investment, specifically urban real estate. And specifically housing. And so if tenants can throw wrenches in those systems, they can create a crisis for capital. And we need to be able to be prepared for the consequences of that, to take power. But it's a structurally important position that I don't think a lot of analysis has pinpointed before. In the same way that we pinpoint teachers, nurses, logistical workers, tenants are in a similar kind of important structural position in the capitalist economy right now.
One of the things that you had mentioned, Sam also wrote a piece this week kind of analyzing some of the results of the recent victory, and one of the things that you said was that one of the key pieces of that victory is that it's breaking the link between investment and rising rents. So as you've said, landlords can no longer buy a property just on the assumption that the rents will be able to go up in these really insane ways because loopholes are being exploited. So Daniel, I wanted to ask how that relates to your vision for housing as part of a Green New Deal, how you see that idea of breaking the link between public and private.
Great, thank you. Let me take a slightly circuitous way to answer that question. I'm an academic, so it's professional responsibility. Yeah, I mean, I think eviction is the main threat that I think many, many, many Americans and people around the world face, the main existential threat. Climate change you could think of as the ultimate form of collective and violent eviction that threatens us. And I think it would be logical to think about climate change and eviction as the two main existential threats that we face in the short term and in the long term in this century. And so we need a Green New Deal for housing to kind of prevent both of those things from happening at the same time. Very quickly, housing, as anybody in this room would recognize, is just as important as the employment sector as a driver of inequality, and in particular, racial inequality. So I think insofar as the Green New Deal is going to tackle inequality, it has to tackle housing inequality. Millions of people will be displaced by climate change. In the US alone, something like 13 million just from sea level rise. And we hope to also welcome millions and millions of climate refugees and immigrants. So we need to build a lot of new housing. And the thing is that a Green New Deal for housing could be a very powerful lever for decarbonizing the economy. So one of those, of course, is efficiency, energy upgrades. Currently, housing is responsible for about 1/6 of the US's greenhouse gas emissions. But the other issue, and this is what you asked about, is that right now, with the private land market, every time you invest in a place to make it better, and that includes densification, it includes public transit, it includes forms of greening to make resiliency. Every time you invest in an urban location to make it better in terms of climate change, you also raise land values. And that means that you are systematically seeing the gentrification and then the displacement out of increasing, improved greened areas of working class people, of poor people, of people of color. In Miami, you are even seeing now that neighborhoods with higher ground are having disproportionate increases in land prices, causing displacement in neighborhoods like Little Haiti that can only be explained by the anticipation of sea level rise in that city. So there's no way to create climate-friendly urban spaces, low carbon and resilient for everybody, unless you can improve places without jacking up the rent and without jacking up land values. And the only way to then do that is two things. One, to basically end the private market in rentals, or at least have something like rent control so that improvements don't bring up the rent. And of course, the other is to provide more of the housing supply through public housing. And that's why I propose in this article, inspired by the example of Vienna, which maybe we'll get into, a kind of, not the only demand for a housing Green New Deal, but as the kind of banner that we could rally around, the big demand in the spirit of the times, 10 million public, no carbon, beautiful mixed income public homes. Diversity of design, diversity of governance structure, reservations, towns, suburbs, and cities, a new model of housing, beautiful, no carbon housing that anybody would be happy and proud to live in, and in fact a whole range of different people should live in. And I think that we live in a time when if a demand isn't bold and big enough, it just doesn't exist. Free public college, Medicare for all, and now we need a demand comparably important, helpful, and ambitious for housing. And I think a Green New Deal is the perfect moment to bring that to fruition.
So this is a question that I think anyone can answer if you guys want to jump in, but what do you think it would take for the government to embrace its role as a provider of housing? So like right now in New York, we're seeing obviously a crisis in the last bastion of really successful public housing in the US. Even the sort of most ambitious plans that we've seen from presidential candidates are like, how can we get how can we incentivize private developers to build and private landlords to accept vouchers for low-income tenants? And truthfully, we've seen in many areas like disastrous results when the government has been a provider of housing. We've seen it in New York City where the government became a landlord of last resort for a lot of foreclosed homes during the fiscal crisis and then wasn't really able or willing to do the work to maintain those homes. We've obviously seen it in a lot of really struggling public housing authorities across the country. So I'm just curious what you guys think it would take for the government to really embrace and succeed in its role as a public housing provider.
I mean, two things. I mean, first of all, it would take money. The People's Policy Project, which inspired me with its call for 10 million social housing units in 10 years, and then we should do more and more afterward, points out that to do that would require a lot of money and significantly less than the Trump tax cut. So there's the matter of building massive new housing, and that's expensive. The second point is that in a lot of cases, the new social housing we would produce would not necessarily have to be massive capital-intensive new housing projects. I was recently in South Baltimore talking with people from United Workers, which is a local campaign for environmental justice, racial justice, housing justice. And what the effort there is to buy up distressed properties and add them up and make community land trusts out of them. And I think the capacity for the government to impose terms which would allow it to very cheaply buy up and rehab existing housing stock in cities that don't have hot markets and turn that over to ordinary people to manage themselves but off the market is another thing we could think about that's not impossible to do. And the third point related to that, in terms of how would we actually do this, is I've been reading more in depth lately about the financial crash, and even some of the most senior people in Obama's kind of coterie in the fall of 2008 were saying, listen, you have essentially nationalized the housing sector via the banking sector. You could impose things like cram downs where bankruptcy judges can essentially radically reduce the principal on mortgages. You could also buy up for pennies on the dollar a huge number of distressed mortgages and then find a public authority to manage those and lease those back out to the occupants. They would never have to be evicted at low costs indefinitely. When we think about the next financial crisis, there's a huge opportunity where the federal government will have the real estate and the financial sector over a barrel. And is it going to help those CEOs back up and straighten their ties like the last time? Or will it use that power to impose terms to really change the structure of the market? So I think we can really radically underestimate how much power the government has to do things, even if we leave aside the question of constructing a massive amount of new housing, which I think we should do. But even net of that, there is a huge amount of tools and levers at our disposal, especially during the next crisis that is guaranteed to come.
Yeah, I think that that's right.
And I think that we shouldn't underestimate the way in which the various iterations of the financial crisis, both the I will say I don't know what it will take. I really don't. And one of the lessons from this rent campaign that we just ran is just how embedded a property rights framework is in the way that pretty much everyone, even pretty much everyone thinks about housing. Like the landlords have to get something too. We took landlord profit from, on average, 20% to 6%, and they're like saying that the housing market is going to crash and there's going to be a massive foreclosure crisis in New York's rental housing stock. And if that does happen, maybe it's not the worst thing. Maybe that's an opportunity for some municipal intervention. So that's one thing. But the sort of lesson that I have coming out of what Daniel said and this campaign that we just ran is that we have a big opportunity as socialists to build a mass movement of renters, and the various iterations of the financial crisis have made that more and more and more possible, between the fact that there was a financial crisis and a mortgage foreclosure crisis that stole people's homes from them, and between the fact that many of us have medical debt or college debt that makes taking out a mortgage in the first place deeply unattractive. There is a greater share of our population that is renting, and what Sam said, renters are operating and holding a strategic place in our society right now, where socialists should be organizing. The bigger the sort of class of renters, the political class of renters gets, the more opportunity there is to force the government to take its responsibility to house the population seriously. I think that it's very, very important that we organize renters and homeless people specifically. Our housing policy is completely structured around different ownership models, around home ownership, and also around, how can we give developers or bribe developers to house low-income people. I think it's incredibly important that as we're talking about what it would take to build a social housing movement, that we are talking about renters all the time. And we're sort of overcoming this sort of ideological barrier that people have around what it would mean to live in a renter society. I think many of us in this room even are like, one day I probably want to own a home. And that's fine, right? That's our primary wealth building mechanism, and I hope that if that's what you want, you can one day have it. But that ideology is holding us back from a massive government intervention to build public housing, and that's something that we have to challenge, and we're only going to challenge it if we normalize renting. And so I think that's something that we really need to think about, and I think we're in a historical moment where we have the opportunity to do that.
Those are both great points and a really tough question. And so yes, we need a movement, which we're all building, and that movement needs to actually demand the public provision of housing, which has not really been a top-level demand for a while. We need models, which could mean what we're demanding and what we're dreaming of, but also municipalities that start doing this to show that it's possible, and a better understanding of our own history to show how it's been done. One case that I've been thinking a lot about is Washington, D.C. with its TOPA and DOPA Acts, which stands for Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and District Opportunity to Purchase Act, which were passed in the late 70s or early 80s, and basically give tenants or the city the right of first refusal on sales to multifamily buildings. And it's not really used all that much because it's just too damn expensive for anybody to buy right now because it's a hot property market. But when prices were a lot lower, it actually was, and those all got turned into limited equity co-ops. And that didn't require a federal government, a Ben Carson, a Donald Trump, to take the initiative. So that's important too. I guess, and of course, we need money, so we need taxes. But then, I don't know, it just all comes back to can this government take on that role? Or would we need an entirely new government? What can the capitalist state do in terms of the public provision of housing? It can do a lot more than it is doing So this is not to say that there's nothing it can do. But that maybe we should be also comfortable understanding the limits of what the capitalist state could even do while still being the capitalist state to understand what more we would need. I think that was sufficiently circular, but you all know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And so I guess going back to the idea of models, Daniel, you had brought up Vienna, and so I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that or about what types of models we could be looking to for a Green New Deal in housing.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think Vienna is a great model, and in Vienna now, 1/3 of the housing is provided by municipal authorities. 1/3 is cooperative, and 1/3 is private market. That is just almost impossible to imagine from the U.S. perspective, and all of the housing in Vienna is fantastic. The origins of that is that the Social Democrats, essentially the communists, when Red Vienna started in 1919, the left party saw itself as doing a third way between Lenin and German Social Democrats. So that's the original third way, right? And they were like, if we do a communist revolution, we'll get invaded. So we're just going to cap rents at, in public housing at about 3% of the average semi-skilled worker's salary, 3%. And one of the motives, the federal government even agreed to do this because they said, when Vienna separated from Hungary, suddenly they had to import coal to build things, and the coal was very expensive. And what the government said was, we can't destroy industry, the productive sector of the economy. Landlords are going to eat it. We're going to institute national rent control so that rents will become so low that we can afford to pay workers' wages and import the energy. Now, obviously our model is not coal, but the fundamental idea is like the landlord class is going to eat it so that our society can do what it needs to do, I think is a powerful precedent. And then what you have is the construction of a model of social housing where the different units were all built by fantastic architects with things like libraries, community centers, dental clinics inside. And it was the result, the social housing model of, yes, the labor movement and the socialist movement, and the public health movement, and the feminist movement in Vienna, which was born on the barricades of 1848, the European People's Spring. So you have a vision of basically what they wouldn't have necessarily called social reproduction feminism informing a construction project where you had the best artisans, the best craftsmen, and world-class cultural institutions all going together to kind of assist with housing. And I think if we think now what that model teaches us is that housing really can work as an intersectional demand. And just to skip ahead, what you said about the tenants movement is absolutely right. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaigned on housing, and now she's the champion of the Green New Deal. And it makes complete sense to imagine tenants movements, largely led, as they are now, around the world by women of color, black and brown women, next to movements like Sunrise. I mean, there's no reason why they're not there together campaigning for the same things. They can be, I think increasingly they are. In New York, I could think about Rachel Rivera as an incredible leader in New York Communities for Change. Her daughter was almost killed by a collapsing roof during Hurricane Sandy. And if you look her up, I spent some time with her, but if you look her up in media clippings, she's fighting against rezoning in Crown Heights and fighting for New York City climate policies. And the housing movement in New York is the reason that New York City passed, just before Earth Day, the country's most ambitious low-carbon building energy bill. So there's a real possibility that's emerging now to link up the tenants movements you're talking about and the climate movement and building a coalition big enough, strong enough, deep enough to really, like you said, transform the economy and transform the state itself, transforming the meaning of public power.
So you mentioned there are a number of fights that both have happened and are continuing to happen against rezonings in New York and elsewhere. And Sam, in the issue you talked about what zoning can and can't do, and yet it's sort of one of the few places where a lot of community groups feel like they can intervene in what's going on in the neighborhood. Having been involved in some fights against rezonings myself, it's incredibly frustrating, and people's power is incredibly limited. So I'm curious, both are there circumstances where you think it makes sense to intervene in the zoning process? Are there circumstances where it doesn't make sense? And sort of what can people do to try to really have a say in planning in their cities and make them more democratic?
I think it's not so much are there situations where it makes sense and are there situations where it doesn't, as it has to be a big part of our movement, but it can't be all of it. And there's reasons why it becomes all of our focus. And it's bigger than us and our organizations. It has to do with the fact that that is one of the ways that cities are trying to do everything. They get all sorts of things done through zoning. It's become the means to address climate. It's become the means to address affordability. It's become the means to give money away to landlords. It's become a tool towards many, many, many things. And that's in part because of the parallel systems of devolution and centralization of control. So since the mid-70s, like everything we talk about, we've seen the federal government taking away its responsibility for more and more things that fall then on cities. So the federal government, like we talked about, is no longer producing public housing or putting out federal funds for it. It doesn't pay for transit operations anymore, only the capital. And so cities and states then have to pick up that tab, and that's what we call devolution. But at the same time as power is devolving to cities, there's also a centralization of control at higher levels over what they can do with that power. So the tax money that they have is restricted. There's all sorts of, like you made mention of the Clinton era rule that says that cities or public housing authorities can't have a net increase in their housing stock, or else the federal government won't pay for it. So there's all sorts of restrictions at the top at the same time as responsibilities drop down to the bottom, which leaves land use as the main thing that cities have a lot of power over, which has enormous consequences. So then they try to do everything through land use, and land use gets reduced to zoning. And so then if the state at the local level is trying to fix everything through zoning, the social movements, including the unions, often intervene in the zoning process in order to get what they want, which may be affordable housing, which may be space for them to operate in, which may be jobs, maybe all sorts of things. But zoning becomes the place to have all these other fights. That's pretty dangerous because zoning is not really the place to be doing much of that. Like, you can't do rent control through zoning. It doesn't really work. You probably aren't going to do public housing through zoning either. So now we've eliminated the two most important demands of the tenant movement. You also don't have enormous jobs creation through zoning, so now we get rid of the labor movement too. So everyone is then fighting for scraps through zoning. On the other hand, zoning is hugely important in terms of the affordability of neighborhoods, in terms of the built environment and whether or not rental apartments even exist. And so you can't ignore it either. So now we're stuck in this nuanced position, aka a trap, where it's too important to ignore and not powerful enough to be the center of our demands. So we always have to do zoning plus. We can never just do zoning. Zoning plus rent regulation, zoning plus public housing, zoning plus community land trust, zoning plus a jobs program, etc. It's never going to be through zoning alone, and if it is, then we get stuck in this shitty binary of NIMBY-YIMBY, not in my backyard or yes in my backyard, which is the stupidest argument, and everyone knows it, but that's where zoning politics leads you. Yes or no in your backyard. Who here has a backyard, by the way? It makes no sense for this city, which is enormously dense already. And it's two forms of status quo. Either we protect people's privilege through the built environment, NIMBY, or we give away huge amounts of opportunity to the already most structurally powerful force in urban politics, real estate. Those are the two choices that leaves. So we get stuck in that trap if we have a zoning-only politics. That doesn't mean don't care about zoning. That doesn't mean don't fight about zoning. Fighting about zoning is most of what I find myself doing, but it's important to understand the limitations of that fight and how to break our way through it.
Yeah, I think that's really a helpful analysis. And everyone else agrees with that. So knowing that there are so many different arenas for the tenant movement to be fighting in, and I think given the changes that have just happened in New York, where both we now have this like somewhat permanent arena to fight on the state level, since the rent reforms are not expiring, they don't have a sunset date, and also knowing that we now have all these additional arenas for local organizing, since local municipalities are able to now opt into the system of rent stabilization. See, I was curious what you see in broad strokes as the terrain for the tenant movement in the coming years, and sort of what are the targets, how are we going to continue to build this power and sort of shift the framework?
Yeah. Wow. So I said this earlier, I am still thinking about the lessons of what just happened in New York last week, it really is monumental. But we didn't do everything. We really didn't. There are still ways that landlords are going to be able to raise rents on rent-stabilized renters. And we need to organize more tenants. We just do. Our laws still only apply to buildings with 6 or more units built before 1974. So a lot of people, I mean, how much of this room rents in a building with less than 6 apartments in it? Probably a significant portion of you. So our laws still leave out millions of people in New York. And the real estate industry is, unfortunately, right now, more flexible than we are. So one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet on this panel, but that I'm happy that we won, is that we actually won rent control for manufactured home communities in New York State, which is a big deal. These are basically colloquially known as trailer parks. And in recent years, people basically, they own the home, but they don't own the land. And in recent years, private equity companies have been buying up manufactured home communities at an astonishing rate, and raising the lot rent, and folks can't really move. This is a big source of affordable housing in rural areas. So we run rent control there. That is a massive opportunity to organize between urban, rural, and suburban across the state to build this renter movement. We are going to wage ETPA expansion campaigns in Rochester and Buffalo and Syracuse and Newburgh and all these places to bring rent stabilization. But we still deeply need, as private equity money is flowing into unregulated small apartment buildings in parts of New York City, because of the rezonings. Like, these things are really intertwined. As the de Blasio administration moves to rezone Bushwick and Staten Island, private equity is moving to buy up small apartment buildings in these neighborhoods where there's like a massive potential to raise rents. So we need better tools to prevent evictions and to prevent massive rent hikes in buildings that aren't covered by rent stabilization. And it's hard to organize unregulated tenants. There is a massive risk for people who don't have any tenants' rights at all, but it's a critical next step for the tenant movement to organize folks who don't really have any rights right now at all.
Cool. And I don't know if just as a follow-up, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit, just Sia or anyone else, about like the role of private equity in housing, especially in the last 10 years or so since the housing crisis, because I think increasingly, it's like kind of interesting during the recent campaign. A lot of the landlord marketing was saying that, because of this, small mom and pop landlords are not going to be able to maintain their properties, and so they're going to have to sell them. And that is, in fact, what's happening, but it's not happening because of rent regulation. It's happening because private equity is kind of invading the market. So I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about what's been happening, especially in New York, but in a lot of places with private equity.
I can start, and then Sam and Daniel know a lot about this too, but I just want to say that the average portfolio size for the average landlord in New York is 894 units. And they own 21 buildings, and that's the average. So the mom and pop landlords that that the real estate industry was featuring in their ad campaigns, they own 150 units. Some of them own 150 units. The vast majority of people don't, most people in New York City don't own their home. So this mom and pop landlord thing is really a myth. It's really just not true. But I think it speaks right to the center of American capitalism and our sort of ideology. That's an incredibly sympathetic person, more sympathetic than a renter to your average New York policymaker or politician. And our sort of political structure is organized around a small property owner or a small business owner, and that's a really challenging thing that we have to overcome as a movement. But yeah, 21 buildings and 894 apartments, and that's 894 families' homes where the landlord basically can do whatever they want. And it's increasingly companies like Blackstone and Brookfield, and these are groups that are expecting a 20 to 30% return on an investment. And in many cases, they're using unions and public pension funds to raise the capital to buy our homes. And so there is again, it all points back to what Sam said, is that tenant organizing is like a really, really critical and strategic sector to be doing work right now for people who want to basically break capitalism.
Can I say a quick thing about pensions? So Sia just mentioned pension money going into buying up a lot of these properties, and that's true. The big Hudson Yards development is largely financed with Canadian municipal pension fund money. So that's workers' money going into luxury real estate, and that really has a pretty strong impact on how the labor movement sees the tenant movement. If real estate is primarily a vehicle for future pension fund growth, then tenants are sort of getting in the way of that growth. And you have seen cases, especially in California, of public pension funds buying out affordable housing and evicting residents, some of whom are union members in those same unions. I mean, that's an extreme example, but that's kind of like where this logic gets us. So also, rank and file union member campaigns around housing, I think, are kind of the only way out of that. Only if the unions feel like they can't continue to do that and remain in leadership would they change their behavior, because otherwise the money in it is too strong, and it's labor's capital. It's labor's capital being invested in displacing other workers, which will then return to workers in the form of pension. So it's not without reason, but I think there is a real role for union members here in addressing some of that.
I might build on that. I think there's some interesting analogies between the climate fight and the housing fight that have come up here. One of the obvious ones, if you look at New York State politics, is the imperative for upstate, downstate organizing. And the climate movement was really lucky in a way that after the People's Climate March in 2014, some of the leaders saw an opportunity and a necessity to go upstate, downstate. But I think in many respects, that's learning from the tenant movement, that's necessary. There's, of course, the parallel of cheap money. I mean, the fracking boom in West Texas is largely financed by what we think of as subprime money, very fragile. The pension issue, as you raised, I think the big difference is that oil is maybe the biggest industry, most powerful industry in the history of the world, but it won't be forever. And in fact, even the Bank of England's governor is saying things like, you should really think twice about holding money in oil. Their value is based on reserves, which if we burned, that would take us through the barriers of climate breakdown 5 times. So there's just going to be a massive correction in oil. But whatever happens with climate change, real estate is not going to go away at all. And the governor of the Bank of England is not saying you should think twice about investing in real estate. And that's where I think the pension issue is really interesting. There has been some success, actually, in green bonds, which offer lower rates of return, are very, very heavily subscribed by pensions from public sector workers in Scandinavia, Ontario, and in California. Labor movements whose pension managers are willing to take a slightly lower return. They think it's less risky and invest in climate change. But that's not happening enough. Pension capital is a huge share of global capital. And as you mentioned, this issue of real estate. And I think what that gets us to really realize is that we tend to think of, on the left, shop floor struggles as where labor really hits. The laborer fights against the boss on the shop floor. That's one arena of power. And then, the David Harvey kind of economic Marxists are like the power of investment. And what you're helping us see, Sam, I think, and some of the stuff around climate is actually those two are really linked up through the issue of pensions. And so we tend to think way too narrowly about the labor politics of these issues, whether it's just building trades unions and housing, but actually there's a huge labor movement of people who live in homes, or in climate. The whole question of climate and jobs is just, are we unionizing solar plant factories, which we obviously should, but the question of labor's relationship to capital is a really big question. And I think if we can get more expansive and more ambitious as our movements grow, we can maybe multiply the tools that we have to really go after the kind of the big players, who are roaming around the earth and making giant investment decisions.
I just want to say one more thing. It's also really critical that tenants are workers and workers are tenants, and it's really critical that rank and file union members organize in their workplaces and in their unions for housing demands, precisely because that's how our enemies are trying to divide us. It's how the real estate industry tries to divide us. And depending on the union, quite successfully in New York, land use rights, for example. And it's what they tried to do in this rent control fight as well. Their landlords were telling their employees, that they needed to get on the bus to go to Albany to rally against rent protections. And so there is this real false narrative that's pushed, that if you have stronger tenant protections, you won't have jobs, and if you have jobs, you won't have affordable housing. Or I didn't say that right, but you know what I mean. So it's really critical that we don't let that be. It's successful, and that we don't let that be the story of our movement.
Thanks. So I think that's a great place actually to invite some of the folks who are in the live audience to chime in if you have questions or comments, and we'll let the folks who are watching the live stream go, and you can enjoy the rest of your evenings. So do we have